You are somewhere on Earth right now. Whatever continent you're on, your ancestors were not from there. Not originally. Every single human alive today is descended from people who walked out of Africa. Not metaphorically, literally walked, on foot, across terrain that would kill a modern person with no equipment. The distance from East Africa to the southern tip of South America, where humans arrived roughly 15,000 years ago, is about 25,000 kilometers, with no roads, no maps, no goal, no one in charge of the route. And they did it in 50,000 years, which sounds like a long time, until you realize that's only about 2,000 generations, about the same number of generations that separate you from ancient Rome. So how? No maps, no plan, no idea what was ahead of them. How do people end up on every continent on Earth when nobody set out to go anywhere in particular? Let's be honest about what we're actually talking about. No single human ever crossed a continent. Let's start there. The migration happened across thousands of generations. An individual group might move 20 to 50 kilometers from their birth range in a lifetime, following herds, water, better conditions. That's it. Nobody was going to Australia. Nobody was crossing the Americas. Each group just moved a little. Their children moved a little more. The accumulated movement of 2,000 generations added up to 25,000 kilometers. But even with that framing, the barriers were genuinely extreme. To reach Australia from Southeast Asia around 65,000 years ago, early humans had to cross open ocean. Even at the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age, there was a minimum 70 kilometers of open water. No land bridge, open sea, in boats or rafts made from materials that leave almost no archaeological trace. To reach the Americas, they crossed Beringia, the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, during some of the coldest winters on Earth, minus 40 degrees Celsius. No food except what they hunted. Hundreds of kilometers of frozen nothing in every direction. At a site called Majed Bebe in northern Australia, researchers led by Chris Clarkson found the oldest confirmed evidence of humans in Australia, dated to approximately 65,000 years ago. That makes it the earliest confirmed open ocean crossing in human history. 65,000 years ago. 70 kilometers of open water. In a world with no written language, no compass, no metal. On paper, a slow reproducing social primate with no fur, no natural weapons, and no knowledge of what lay beyond the next mountain range should not have colonized every habitable landmass on Earth in 50,000 years. But every other large mammal was trying to survive the world as it was. Humans had a completely different approach. The single most important driver of human migration wasn't curiosity. It wasn't ambition. It wasn't the desire to explore. It was food. Ancient human groups followed seasonal animal migrations, moving with herds across hundreds of kilometers every year, tracking food sources rather than choosing destinations. A group that followed a migrating herd would cover vast distances without ever intending to migrate. And here's what made humans uniquely capable of this: persistence hunting. You don't chase an animal at full speed, you track it at a jog, just fast enough to keep it moving. For 3, 4, 6 hours, the animal runs, stops, overheats, runs again. It can't cool down while moving. Eventually, it collapses from heat stroke, and you walk up and kill it. Humans are the only species on Earth that hunts this way, and it meant human hunting ranges were enormous, far larger than any other land predators. Picture a group in East Africa 70,000 years ago. They're not trying to reach India. They don't know India exists. They're following a herd that's been moving northeast for 3 weeks. The herd crosses a river into new territory. The group crosses too. Their children are born in that new territory. Their grandchildren never know the place their grandparents came from. The greatest migration in the history of any species was, at its core, just people following their next meal. Rivers fundamentally shaped human migration routes. They provided fresh water, food, and most importantly, direction. Following a river downstream is one of the easiest forms of travel available to a group with no map. The water always goes somewhere. It always goes downhill, toward the coast. And at the coast, something was waiting that should have stopped them, but didn't. Around 65,000 years ago, a group of humans in Southeast Asia faced a minimum 70 kilometers of open water. They built something that floated, and they crossed it. We don't know what those boats looked like. Wood and plant fiber don't survive 65,000 years in the ground. But we know they existed because people were standing in Australia when they arrived. Somewhere in Southeast Asia, around 65,000 years ago, a group built something seaworthy enough to cross 70 kilometers of open Pacific. Maybe they chased fish and went further than intended. Maybe a storm pushed them. Maybe they could see something on the horizon on a clear day. Whatever the reason, they landed. They stepped onto a continent that no human had ever touched. And they had no way of knowing that. The first people to reach Australia didn't conquer a new world. They just didn't drown. And that was enough to change history forever. Ancient human navigation across unknown terrain worked through oral tradition. Descriptions of landmarks, water sources, seasonal patterns, animal behavior, safe routes, passed generation to generation, in songs, in stories, in ceremony. Australian Aboriginal songlines are the best surviving example. An oral navigation system encoding geographical information across thousands of kilometers of terrain in song. Researchers have confirmed that these oral systems could encode and transmit accurate geographic knowledge across hundreds of generations, without a single written word, without a single drawn map. A child in Central Asia 40,000 years ago is learning a song from their grandmother. The song describes a sequence of landmarks, a specific shaped mountain, a river that runs east before turning north, a rock formation near fresh water. The child doesn't know they're learning navigation. They think they're learning a story. 20 years later, leading a group through unknown territory, that story tells them exactly where to find water. They crossed the world with no maps. Their maps were the stories they told their children. Human groups don't move into unknown territory when life is good. They move when resources run out, when the group grows too large for the land, when conflict makes staying dangerous, when drought or disease or climate shift forces the issue. Every major wave of human migration correlates with stress events. Around 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano called Toba erupted, the biggest volcanic eruption in the last 2 million years. The ash cloud may have triggered a volcanic winter lasting years. Some researchers believe it reduced the global human population to just a few thousand individuals. The out-of-Africa migration, around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, follows closely after. The groups that spread north and east were very likely pushed out of depleted regions, not pulled by curiosity about what lay beyond, pushed by the simple fact that staying had stopped working. A group in East Africa around 70,000 years ago. The rains have been wrong for 3 seasons. The animals they relied on are scarcer. Another group has claimed the best water source nearby. Staying means competing for shrinking resources with people who know the terrain as well as you do. Following the coast north, the way the birds seem to come from, is frightening. But staying has stopped working. They go. Not because they were brave, because they had no better option. They weren't explorers. They were people with nowhere left to go. And it turned out that was enough to change the map of the world. Here's what changes everything you just heard. The migration sounds inevitable, like the species spreading because it could. But genetic evidence tells a different story. Every non-African person alive today, Every person in Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas descends from a single small group who crossed out of Africa roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. Not a large wave, not multiple independent migrations, one small band, walking north along the African coast, at one specific moment in time. The rest of the world's human population at that time, the other groups who had been living in Africa for 200,000 years, either never left or left and left no surviving descendants. The colonization of every continent outside Africa came down to one group making one set of decisions that happened to work. A slightly different drought, a slightly different storm, a slightly different coastline. And none of us outside Africa exist. It wasn't destiny. It was a coin flip that came up heads. And the people whose coin came up tails simply didn't make it into the story we tell about ourselves. You're back looking at that map. East Africa, your location, 25,000 kilometers. Every step of that distance was taken by someone who didn't know they were taking it, someone who was following a herd, someone crossing a river because the food was on the other side, someone singing a navigation story to a child who would use it 20 years later in territory nobody in their family had ever seen. Someone who left because staying had stopped working. None of them planned to get here. None of them knew where here would eventually be. But every single one of them made one more decision to keep going. And that chain of small, unplanned decisions is why you exist, where you exist, right now. Nobody decided to travel that far. Nobody looked at a map and chose a destination. They just followed the food, one season at a time. And 50,000 years later, their grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren were standing on a different continent, with no idea how far they'd come.